Luthien is basically like, look, we have you by the throat. If you don't surrender this entire tower to me, we're going to take off your skin. So I imagine that would be very inconvenient for Sauron. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of my new YouTube project, Makeup and Middle-earth Monday. It is a show where I do a makeup look and pick a topic from Tolkien's Legendarium to discuss while I do said makeup look. Today I'm going to be talking about Sauron, the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, the villain of Lord of the Rings, and the titular character of that trilogy. For the sake of clarity, I will be discussing his history from the books primarily, but I do have very fond feelings for Peter Jackson's trilogy, so it's hard for me not to want to make comparisons. If you've ever found yourself wondering what this guy's deal is or where he came from, but did not have the spoons to read up on it, fear not. I've done all of that work for you. And if you would like to offer an opinion about a future topic or vote on future options, please consider checking out my Facebook page or even my Patreon. The links to both of those will be in the description if you are interested. Probably goes without saying there will be spoilers in this video. I'm going to be covering a very long span of time, from before Sauron's fall to evil to his fate at the final end of the War of the Ring. So if you're concerned about spoilers, please click away now. This video will be going live on Halloween, so in order to make things festive, I have decided to do a spooky look for my makeup this week. If we played at LARP together this past weekend, you've probably seen this look that I'm about to do. It is the Reaper look for a death. It's like a creepy death spirit. And I will be putting a list of the products I used in the description box as well. And if you want to see what my SMA looks like, I will be sharing like a picture of that towards the end of the video also. So who was Sauron? Well, he had several names and titles, one of which was the Lord of Werewolves. Ooh, spooky, festive. The name Sauron is a Quenya Elvish name, and it means the abhorred. In Sindarin, he was also called Gurthar, which means the cruel. He's been known as the Deceiver, the Necromancer, the Shadow, among many, many other titles. First, though, when at the beginning of creation, he was known as Myron, the Admirable. This would be when he lived with the Valar before joining forces with Morgoth. I want to go a little into the Ainulindale, just for context, just a little, please, don't click away yet. Don't leave yet. I promise I'm gonna keep it simple. I know, as soon as people open the Silmarillion and they get to that chapter, I know so many people who have quit reading just based on that one chapter, but I promise I'll be quick. So the Ainulindale is the beginning, essentially, when things really started to happen. The one god, Eru Iluvatar, existed in the void and decided to create some friends, essentially, the Ainur. The Ainur were tasked with creating and governing the world that we will eventually come to call Middle-earth. And the Ainur come in two tiers, I guess. The Valar are the upper level, and the Maiar are the lower level. Kind of like archangels and regular angels, I guess. So each of the Valar have their own domain, kind of, that they govern, and they have Maiar who follow them, or serve under them, essentially. So Sauron, or Myron at the time, was a Maya who worked under Aule, who was the Vala of crafting and smithing. So even from the beginning, Sauron was super into making some dope-ass jewelry. And yeah, so he's been making some cool shit for a long time. Fun fact, the Maya that eventually became Saruman was also one of the Maiar working under Aule. Remember the Balrog? Maya. The wizards are Maiar who were sent to Middle-earth. They were sent in the Third Age specifically to help the Free Peoples with the threat Sauron posed. They were essentially put in the bodies of old men to facilitate better interaction with the common people, I guess, because, you don't fear not kind of thing. Like, old men aren't quite as threatening as powerful angelic beings with otherworldly abilities. And, also being in an old man body, I think, put limit on their powers. I imagine this would be rather frustrating. But Sauron became a Dark Lord long before the wizards came into play. Was he evil at the beginning? No. I personally don't think he was. I think that he had some character flaws that, we're going to discuss that kind of led to his downfall or, very much contributed towards it. Sauron was noted for being very lawful. He liked to keep everything in order in its proper place. I personally would consider him to be like the poster child for a lawful evil villain. He started as a very talented Maya, a very powerful one. He was one of the first Maya to walk out of the void, so he's been around since pretty much the beginning. And obviously he was relatively ambitious, but he also didn't like to wait for his plans to kind of fall into place. He was impatient, and that impatience really serves as his downfall a few times. I believe Professor Tolkien had spoken about drawing inspiration for Sauron and Sauron's attitudes from some real-world dictators at the time. And obviously, I can't talk about Sauron or his fall from grace without touching on his relationship with Morgoth, aka the original Dark Lord. Yes, there was a Dark Lord before Sauron, and he played a big role before the First Age and for the entire duration of the First Age. He was the most powerful of all the Valar, but he was cruel and deceitful, and he enjoyed causing chaos. And you might think that would conflict with Sauron's love of order, but you have to understand that because Morgoth was so extremely powerful, Sauron found that very attractive because he also wanted the ability to make his own plans happen quickly, and Morgoth certainly had that ability, at least in the time span that would be considered quick by immortal angelic beings like they are. So yeah, I don't think that Sauron started out evil, but he was definitely corrupted very early in the history here, so I don't know, maybe it doesn't really matter if he didn't start out evil. But there's a lot of history behind this character. So, we can imagine Sauron working under Aule during the early Valiant years while the Valar were creating the physical world, and they were creating it in preparation for the elves because Eru Ilúvatar, the one god, had, shown them a vision of Middle-earth and essentially told them, the elves are going to be here at some point, it's your job to make the world ready for them, was essentially their instructions. So they were doing that while Morgoth was stuck in the void, essentially, after being chased out there, the first time he tried to cause some problems. So during this time, Sauron essentially pretended to be friends with everyone, and I personally think that this was a time where he started sowing some seeds of, maybe some discord while he was spying for Morgoth. And eventually when Morgoth returned and started up his shenaniganery again, the Valar moved to Valinor, the Undying Lands. And this is, I think, a perfect example of just how charismatic Sauron was. He was with the Valar for thousands of years, and none of them suspected that he was actually evil. Eventually, though, he did leave to join forces with Morgoth directly, and I don't think it's unfair to say that he was Morgoth's strongest lieutenant. Like, when Morgoth repented and was allowed to kind of chill in Valinor for a while, Sauron was the one in control of Morgoth's old fortress Angband, and Sauron was the one who really kept up like the breeding of orcs and continued to strengthen their position there. So when Morgoth eventually stole the Silmarils, which is, I'm going to go more into that in another video, but when Morgoth eventually stole the Silmarils, Sauron had been very busy growing their forces and getting everything ready for him to take over. So when Morgoth reached Arda, he already had an army ready, thanks to Sauron. And the Noldor elves arrived, including Galadriel and her brother, Finrod, who both of them I'm going to be doing videos on in the next couple of weeks. And my favorite character, who will be in a later episode, King Fingolfin of the Noldor. I love that man. He is a ass. Anyway, though, so Finrod, Galadriel's brother, went on to build Minas Tirith. No, not that one. It's a different one. And this was a really strategic point for the elves to guard against Morgoth in the north, where his fortress was in Angband. And Minas Tirith just means Tower of Guard, so I mean, it's shaped like itself. different Minas Tirith from the Third Age. Finrod built this tower, and I believe it was his nephew Orodreth who held command there during the early First Age. The Noldor elves held Tol Sirion until year 457. And that was when Sauron took it from them after the Dagor Blagalach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. All you really need to know about this battle is that Morgoth opened up Angband after being under siege for a while, and lava just poured out, like monsters poured out, orcs poured out. The first dragon, Glaurung, appeared at this battle. It was really bad for the elves. They weren't really prepared. They didn't expect, I mean, who expects lava? Just release the lava. That's such a metal plan. But the elves were really unprepared for this. And in the process of this battle, that sucked was that Sauron was able to capture Tol Sirion from Orodreth, and Orodreth was forced to flee south. After taking Tol Sirion, Sauron renamed it to Tol Angaroth, which means Isle of Werewolves. Happy Halloween. There he began breeding wolves and catching evil spirits, I guess, to put into those wolves, thus creating werewolves. Hence his title, Lord of Werewolves. Spooky. And this was a really terrible strategic loss for the elves, because the loss of Tol Sirion was really what allowed orcs to make it into Beleriand. Beleriand being the continent that had the most population at the time. In first year, 465, Sauron spots a group of orcs traveling pretty quick across the area that he's watching over from Tol Sirion, or from Tol Angaroth. And these orcs are really booking it. They hadn't checked in or anything, and that's sus. Like, Sauron thinks that is sus. So he brings them in to question them, and he kind of realizes they're not actually orcs. He can't tell who they are, but he can tell they're not orcs. We know, like the reader, we know who these people are. This is a key part of the Beren and Luthien story, and it's also a key part of Finrod's story, so I'm not going to go too much in depth on this. Suffice to say that this group of men were on their way, and by men I mean men and elves in one group together, were on their way to attempt to steal a Silmaril back from Morgoth. They were on their way to Angband when Sauron intercepted them. And with this group is our friend Finrod Felagund, the dude who built the keep that Sauron's big ass took over after the Battle of Sudden Flame. Finrod, I will repeat, was Galadriel's brother. Well, one of them. She had a couple, but I would say he's probably the most well-known one, and I think most people would agree with that. But he, like Galadriel, he had very strong magic, and a lot of this magic he was able to put into effect through song. So I would say you could make an argument for him that he might be a bard, I guess, I've just always thought it was cool how important music and singing is in the Tolkien Legendarium. Professor Tolkien really, you can tell that he really loved poetry and music, and I think it gives the Legendarium this really beautiful layer of depth that makes it feel more like a real place and culture. Anyway, Finrod had used a glamour to disguise them as orcs, and Sauron essentially challenged him to a bard battle. And I'm not sure how common knowledge this is, so I'm just gonna real briefly mention it. But Sauron was a phenomenal singer. As far as I know, all Ainur are, because they came into being through the one god Eru's music, and they sang in his chorus, but he was a phenomenal singer. Phenomenal. And imagine being a mere elf going up against that, a Maya, in a sing-song battle. Finrod was an amazingly talented bard, amazingly talented magic, and so he put up a hell of a fight. But, unfortunately, he did lose. Sauron is, arguably the strongest Maya around, and Finrod's just an elf. How was he supposed to win against that? But even though he wasn't able to win, he did prevent Sauron from actually discerning who they were and what their mission was. Which, cool. But also, Sauron was like, fine, if you're not going to talk, then I'm just going to throw you in the dungeon. And you see this werewolf? He's going to eat all of you. He's going to eat one of you every night until you tell me who you are and what you're up to. And then if you don't, then you'll all just be dead. But none of them gave up any information about who they were. So night after night, they're in this dungeon, and they were thrown in the dungeon. They're naked in this dungeon, completely naked, like buck-ass nude in the dungeon with this werewolf that is eating them one by one. Anyway, while these men are being eaten in the dungeon, Luthien arrives at Tolongaroth with the goodest boy, Huan, the Hound of Valinor. And Huan was just a massive hound, like a giant dog mount. I picture him kind of like an Irish wolfhound, I guess. But this dog was like the size of a small horse, and he was super smart. He never got tired. He could speak sometimes, occasionally, not all the time. He spoke sometimes. But he was super special because he was raised by Orome the Hunter Vala. And through some circumstances that I'll get into a later episode about, he ended up with Luthien and went on the mission with her to rescue Beren from the dungeon before he got eaten by a werewolf. They didn't manage to make it before everybody else got killed by the werewolf, but, they got there, and Sauron knows who Huan is. Like, this hound is famous. Sauron knows who he is, and he knows about this prophecy that only the greatest of all wolves is going to be able to stop this good boy. So Sauron thinks to himself, I'm a strong, independent Maya. I can shapeshift. I'll fulfill that prophecy right the hello now. So he turns into a giant werewolf, and the two of them fight. It's just nasty, fur flying, but eventually Huan wins, because Sauron, as it turns out, is not the awesomest wolf of all time. And Huan gets him by the throat, and Sauron just cannot get free. He tries shape-shifting in like a bunch of different animals, but he just can't get loose, and he's forced to surrender eventually, because Luthien is basically like, look, we have you by the throat. If you don't surrender this entire tower to me, we're going to take off your skin. So I imagine that would be very inconvenient for Sauron. So he agreed to release the tower to her. And as he fled, Huon freed him after he surrendered. He turned into like a giant vampire bat creature, and we really don't hear from him again for the rest of the First Age. Luthien tears his tower down, rescues Bear. And we're blending, and we're blending. Two different products that really aren't supposed to blend together, but I'm doing it anyway because it's easier to do it this way. Throughout the remainder of the First Age, though, things do get really bad for the inhabitants of Arda, and eventually the Valar are forced to come and intercede on behalf of men, dwarves, and elves. This battle was so intense that it sunk the entire continent of Beleriand. The entire continent is now underwater, essentially. They destroyed an entire continent trying to stop Morgoth. And they did. They did stop him. They took him back prisoner. And when Sauron realized that he was on the losing side of this conflict, he went and tried to surrender. He tried to surrender to Eonwe, who is the chief of all of the Maya, I believe. And he served Manwë, who was the chief of all Valar, as Manwë's herald, more or less. And Eonwe was basically like, sure, man, you can come back, but you have to agree to stand trial for your crimes. And so obviously Sauron didn't like that very much, and as soon as he got the opportunity, he bounced the fuck out of there and went back into hiding. And the sinking of Beleriand is really what ended the First Age, and Sauron lays low for a few hundred years into the Second Age, as, you know, men and elves build civilizations again in Middle-earth, which is where they were forced to move to Middle-earth because Beleriand is no longer a place. And it's during this first few hundred years that the men of Numenor established themselves on their isle. This Isle of Numenor was a star-shaped island that was gifted to them for their bravery and, you know, all the work that they did to help stop Morgoth. And this island was far out to the west. Like, the only thing further west from this island was Valinor itself. And this is where we get to what is called the Ban of the Valar, I think is what we call it. And essentially, the Numenorians were gifted this island and this island paradise, essentially. They were all gifted long lifespans and good health and prosperity. But the only thing that they weren't allowed to do, they could sail anywhere they wanted, except west to the Undying Lands, because the Undying Lands are for the Undying. And at first this was fine. The first king of Numenor was Elros. This was Elrond's twin brother, if you're familiar with Elrond from Lord of the Rings. It's the same Elrond. They were both half-elven. Elrond chose to live life as an elf, and Elros chose to take Eru's gift for mortals and die as a man. Eventually. He lived a very long time, but eventually, yeah, he did die. That's how it is. The kingdom of Numenor lasted for 3,287 years before Sauron finally was able to corrupt it. Over time, the Numenorians started colonizing parts of Middle-earth. They helped the middlemen there fight orcs. They helped them build up their settlements. Numenorians founded colonies of their own people all over the place. Some even sailed so far east that they never returned. They just sailed east. So, while Numenor was growing, the first few hundred years of them growing, Sauron was back in Middle-earth. And this is really when he comes into his own and decides, you know what? I'm going to be the next Dark Lord of the world. And this is when he decides to get the ring scheme going. I'm sure you're familiar with that. About 500 years into the Second Age is when we meet this new character, Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. And obviously this is actually Sauron. He approaches the elves in a very fair form. A lot of like really beautiful artwork online of Annatar, but essentially he looks like this handsome elf lord, though I assume the elves knew he was a Maya because he pretended to be an emissary of the Valar. Gil-galad and Elrond and Lindon didn't want anything to do with him, but the elven smiths in Eregion, one famous Celebrimbor among them, were very interested in what Annatar had to say. Celebrimbor was by that point a very well-known elven smith. He was the grandson of Feanor, who most people I think would agree was the greatest elven smith of all time. He was a huge dick though. So anyway, Celebrimbor though was his grandson, and I don't know, I wouldn't be too hard on him for not really seeing through this Annatar disguise. Annatar came with a proposal to show Celebrimbor how to make a set of really cool rings that were intended to help improve Arda, which is Middle-earth. Noldor elves especially really love learning new things and making cool stuff. So, you know, how could we expect this very talented, immortal smith to pass up on the opportunity to learn something new that's cool? All Annatar really had to do was say it was for the sake of, you know, for the sake of creating something beautiful or for the sake of bettering the world around them, and he had Celebrimbor hooked. And of course, Sauron's plan was actually to use these rings to control their bearers. His design was that he would put on the Master Ring, you know, the one, and all of the other ring bearers would fall under his power, thanks to the one ring that he was going to make. And it didn't really work. Not completely. Annatar and Celebrimbor forged 9 rings for men and 7 for dwarves together. Then, after those rings were forged, Sauron left for Mordor, and Celebrimbor forged the 3 elven rings alone, without Sauron's help. And this is when Sauron forged the One Ring, finally. With its power, he planned to hold dominion over everyone in Middle-earth. And then, you know, once he had control over everyone, then he would have perfect order, right? Isn't that how that works? No one could cause any chaos under his rule without that pesky little thing called free will. He put the majority of his power into this ring too, so much so that he obviously became dependent upon it. But he gained the benefits of this ring, and that really helped him amass even larger armies and forces. And even though his plan isn't quite gonna go the way that he hoped, this ring still granted him an enormous boost in power that really helped him dominate other people. Unfortunately for him, the minute he put the One Ring on, the elves knew what was up and they hid theirs. Like, as soon as he put it on, they were like, no. And obviously, he wasn't super thrilled about that. But the elves refused to use their rings until Sauron was no longer in possession of the One Ring, which honestly was the smart move, because can you imagine what would have happened if the elfish rings had fallen? Like, oh man. So yeah, the elves took their rings off, and the dwarvish rings also really didn't work as intended. He had hoped that they would allow him to, you know, take over their minds, and really the only thing that it did to the dwarves was make them more hungry for treasure. Like, if it did anything, that was it. So, like, man, that must suck, Sauron. Your plan didn't really work very well at all. And at this point, I want to quote like one of my favorite podcasts, because it's just funny. Like, just picture Sauron's bitch ass, like, with this grand scheme, ended up not being able to carry it out because it didn't work as intended. So he essentially was like, well, if you're not going to wear them, just give them back. And at this point, I want to quote my favorite podcast, my favorite Lord of the Rings podcast, Keep on Tolkien, where they just make fun of Sauron, like, oh, well, if you're not going to use them, just give them back. Just give them back. And no, everyone was like, no, we're not giving these rings back. Eventually, he did get most of the dwarven rings back. A few of them were destroyed in Dragonfire, I believe. But that's... He eventually did get the majority of the dwarvish rings back. And obviously, as we know, he got all of the 9 rings back because they became ring wraiths. They fell pretty quick, unfortunately. You know, like, pour one out for the kings of men, Ripperoni. But yeah, obviously it pissed Sauron off that his grand scheme didn't work, so he launched an attack against the elves and unfortunately destroyed Eregion in doing so. He took Celebrimbor captive and tortured him for information on the location of the other rings, and poor Celebrimbor did his best, but eventually he gave up the location of the 9 and of the 7. But he never revealed who he had given the Elvish Rings of Power to. And we know that he gave one to Galadriel, he gave one to Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor at the time, and he gave one to Círdan the Shipwright, who was the Lord of the Grey Havens. So yeah, Celebrimbor never gave up the location of the Elvish Rings. Eventually he died from the tortures that Sauron was visiting upon him. And this is pretty gnarly. Sauron ended up using his corpse as a war banner, so that's kind of metal. And I just want to drive home the point of how important Celebrimbor's resistance was in giving up these 3 rings. Once the 9 fell and became Nazgul, their presence bolstered Sauron's forces enormously, and I think it made it easier for him to enslave other races of men. Sauron completed the fortress of Barad-dûr in 1600 of the Second Age, and he kept growing in power as the elves struggled to stop him from essentially taking over all of Middle-earth. Things were looking pretty grim until the Númenóreans showed up to save the day, like the big damn heroes they are. This would have been in the heyday of the Númenórean army. They were an immensely dangerous and capable fighting force. Essentially, just think, I don't know, super soldiers, Captain America, except you have a whole military force made up of super soldiers, essentially. And they showed up and essentially curb stomped Sauron in year 1700 of the Second Age. Sauron retreated back to Mordor after getting his ass beat again. And we don't hear much from him again until nearer the end of the Second Age, when he's finally had enough centuries to raise another army in another attempt to take over Middle-earth. So this dude just will not quit. He will not quit trying to take over Middle-earth. And, you know, now he has a vendetta against Númenor because they brought him low before. So he's building his armies again, trying to take over Middle-earth, and he makes the mistake of declaring himself king of all men. And unfortunately for him, the Númenóreans are still a very strong fighting force. So when Sauron declares himself king of men, the current Númenórean king, Ar-Pharazôn, takes great offense to that, because in Ar-Pharazôn's mind, Ar-Pharazôn is the king of men. And, you know, at this point, I guess I should say Ar-Pharazôn also wants to be the ruler of all Middle-earth. He's arrogant and unfortunately very powerful, and it's under his rule that Númenor eventually does fall. By the time Ar-Pharazôn decides to come and put Sauron back in his place, the Númenóreans had been drifting away from their beliefs in the Valar and their faith in the one god Eru for some time. They're no longer grateful for their island paradise, and they've also begun to resort to piracy. So Ar-Pharazôn arrives in Mordor with his army of super soldier pirates, and Sauron really realizes that he has miscalculated. The Númenóreans beat him really easily the first time, and they're about to do it again. So he has to figure out a way out of this. So what does he do? Obviously, he assumes another fair form and attempts to win Ar-Pharazôn over by flattering him. And it kind of works, I guess. Ar-Pharazôn is basically like, okay, fine, you can surrender, but we're taking you captive. And Sauron is like, to Númenor? Well, yeah, obviously. And at this point, Sauron is filled with glee, so he has to hide it, you know. Oh, no, not captive to Númenor. Oh, please, no. So in Second Age, year 3262, after being taken captive by Ar-Pharazôn, Sauron corrupts him. Well, Sam, you say, these Númenorian fellows, they live a long time. They're super special and super cool. Surely it took a while for him to actually, you know, finish the job of corrupting King Ar-Pharazôn. No, it took him like a year. Like a year. That's how far the Númenóreans had fallen already before Sauron even got involved. Wild, right? I mean, I guess this could also be a good example of Sauron's amazing charisma at work again, but I really think that the Númenóreans were really on their way down anyway, so I don't know that we can really give him full credit. But he definitely had a hand in speeding up that process over that year. So he did this by preying on their fear of death. By the time of his capture, the Númenóreans had already been split into two, I would say, factions. The Kingsmen were established before Ar-Pharazôn became king, but they were still established during his rule. And so the Kingsmen resented the Valar and resented the elves for their immortality, and then the faithful, who still honored their friendship with the elves. Eventually, it became very dangerous to publicly be one of the faithful. Sauron preyed on the Kingsmen's pre-existing fear of death and their sense of entitlement, I guess I could say, that had been developing all this time. During his time as advisor, he managed to convert Ar-Pharazôn and many other Númenóreans to the worship of Morgoth. He essentially convinced Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans that Morgoth was capable of granting them immortality. So, I should get a paper towel for that, but I'm not gonna. This looks really uneven, but it won't matter when I'm finished with the look, because it's gonna be covered up. So, here we are, closer to the latter part of the Second Age, and Sauron is still using Morgoth to try to achieve his own goals. He basically convinces the fallen Númenóreans that Morgoth can save them from their own mortality. He begins overseeing human sacrifices made in Morgoth's name, many of which would have been the faithful. One of the reasons why it became very dangerous to be one of the faithful at this time. These sacrifices were carried out in a temple that Sauron devised himself, which was 500 feet across, 500 feet high, and the walls were like 50 feet thick. It started out with this really beautiful silver dome, but that dome turned black pretty quick thanks to all of the sacrifices going on in there. The smoke from those being burned is what blackened the dome. Pretty gnarly. At this point, the faithful pretty much know they have to get out of Dodge. So they make one last effort to kind of try to get the Valar to intercede, but the emissary that they send to Valinor never returns. And after he disappears, storms start rolling in more. A lot of people start getting struck by lightning in the streets. The temple itself, where all these sacrifices are getting carried out, gets struck by lightning, and it cracks the dome. But for some fucking reason, I don't understand why, but for some reason, Sauron was like on the roof of it when it got struck by lightning, and he was fine, obviously, because he's a Maya, but his followers see him get struck by lightning and like cracks the dome of this temple, and they're just like, yo, this dude's a god. The temple didn't burn down, it just cracked the dome. But I don't know, it's just, Sauron being evil. And yeah, his worshippers thought that was super dope. Eventually, though, he convinces Ar-Pharazôn that the Númenóreans, like, all they have to do is sail to Valinor to seize immortality. But he's gonna stay behind, so they all go. And he's like, no, you go. Someone has to watch home base. So they leave him in Númenor when they sail to the Undying Lands, trying to steal immortality, and obviously that doesn't work out for them. As soon as they touch down, like on the shores of Valinor, Eru reshapes the world. The mountains collapse on top of them, the seas rise, and the entire globe, well, the entire globe becomes a globe, because before this the world was flat, and in doing this, Eru, the one god, made the world round, and in the process this destroyed Númenor, and it sank beneath the seas. That's where the Temple of Morgoth was also finally destroyed, along with Sauron's physical form, but thanks to the Ring of Power, he didn't die, or it wasn't a huge setback for him, really. Although, after this point, Sauron was no longer able to assume a fair form. So, he fled back to Mordor and started amassing armies again. When Númenor sank, the faithful had left by that point, around when Ar-Pharazôn took the fleet to Valinor. And they ended up forming two separate kingdoms, Arnor and Gondor. The guy who founded Arnor was named Elendil, and Gondor was founded by his two sons, Anarion and Isildur, who is Aragorn's ancestor, if you remember him. The fact that they survived the destruction of Númenor made Sauron very cranky, because, he hated the Númenóreans and he wanted to ruin all of them. So he lashed out to attack Elendil and the kingdom in the north, Arnor. But this proving his own impatience can be his downfall again. He struck too soon, his own forces weren't ready yet, and while he had been away, Gil-galad, who was the last High King of the Noldor, had been strengthening his own forces in Middle-earth. So, honoring the friendship of elves and men, Gil-galad joined forces with Elendil, and they began the last alliance of elves and men. In Second Age 34-34, they defeated Sauron's forces in the Battle of Dagorlad, and they sieged his tower of Barad-dûr for 7 years. During the siege, Isildur's brother Anarion was tragically killed, and the siege itself finally ended when Sauron himself came out of the tower and dueled both Elendil and Gil-galad at the same time. They both eventually defeated him, but they died in the process. Elendil's sword broke under him when he fell, and Gil-galad, his death was rough. It was just that Sauron's hands were so hot that he grabbed the Elven King by the face, essentially, and his hand was so hot that he just cooked him. He just cooked him to death. That's fucking gnarly, man. And as you probably guessed, this is when Isildur picked up the broken sword from his father and cut the ring off Sauron's finger. Boom! Sauron is defeated. He was forced to flee as a mere incorporeal spirit. Seemed like he had finally failed in all of his plans, but we know the ring was not destroyed. And the ring was also tied to the foundations of Barad-dûr, so even though they tore down the tower, they weren't able to destroy its foundations, which made it a lot easier for him to rebuild later. Sauron laid low for about 1,000 years into the Third Age, just, TLC, man, recovering. And then in Third Age 1000, he took over the keep of Dol Guldur. By that point, Isildur had long lost the ring in the Gladden River, but Smeagol had not found it yet. Sauron's presence at Dol Guldur really began to corrupt the area around it. And this is really when we start seeing Greenwood the Great becoming Mirkwood. And while he was in Dol Guldur, the elves called him the Necromancer because they didn't realize that it was Sauron at this point. This is when the wizards finally show up. They were sent by the Valar in order to assist the Free Peoples against the threat Sauron was rebuilding. A lot of the land became unsafe during this time. Orcs grew more numerous and bold. Dragons started attacking dwarvish strongholds. This is when a few of the dwarven rings are destroyed. The Nazgul finally reappeared in 1300 of the Third Age. Then in 1635, a plague absolutely decimated Gondor. Everyone was too sick to fight. So many people died. That really forced Gondor to relax its watch on Mordor. They just didn't have the manpower anymore. And this is what allowed the Nazgul to re-enter Mordor itself and start getting it ready for Sauron's return. This is also when the Witch King of the Nazgul took Minas Ithil from Gondor and changed it into Minas Morgul. And the fall of that city is what allowed the Palantir to fall into Sauron's hands when he eventually returned to Mordor later. But before that, Gandalf finally goes to investigate Dol Guldur. Sauron flees because he wants to keep his identity a secret until he's ready for the right moment to strike. Maybe he's finally learning from his mistakes of being impatient all the time. But even though Gandalf isn't able to confirm his suspicions, they become a lot more vigilant over Mordor again. After Sauron flees from Gandalf, he heads east, and personally I think this is probably when he started to lay the groundwork for the enslavement of the men of the South and the East. In 2460, he did return to Dol Guldur, and that's also the same year that Smeagol finally finds the One Ring in the Gladden River, becoming Gollum, you know, in the process there. I'm gonna finish this lip real quick. During the next few centuries, Sauron gets stronger until finally, in 2850, Gandalf proves it's him. They eventually boot his ass out of Dol Guldur, but without the ring, he's really not much of a match for them. And also keep in mind that the White Council at this point has all three Elven Rings of Power, and Saruman is kind of on their side still, I guess. So Sauron just isn't strong enough to take all of them on, so he runs away. But honestly, he's not mad about it. He was pretty much ready to go anyways, and he just returns to Mordor. 10 years after that, I think, he declares himself again, and this is when the Eye of Sauron becomes a thing. I know if you've seen the movies, you're going to be picturing the giant flaming eyeball on top of the tower, but that's not how it was in the books. Peter Jackson added that for cinematic flair, I guess, which is fine. But in the book, he does actually have a corporeal body. He's just weak as shit. And we don't really get a whole lot of information about it. The eye was his symbol. So you would see this start appearing on his heraldry. His orcs will be wearing it. I guess, you know, it becomes a symbol of dread for the people around that area. During this time, as the War of the Ring really starts kind of hitting its stride, is when Bilbo finds the One Ring, is when Smaug the Dragon is killed, when the Battle of Five Armies happens, and Sauron manages to capture Gollum. He has Gollum tortured for information on the whereabouts of the ring, and in year 3017, he sends his ringwraiths to the Shire to find Baggins, and honestly, by sheer luck, they just miss Frodo. Like, when the quest to destroy the ring begins, Sauron really starts going hard on getting Saruman to cripple Rohan. He knows that when he attacks Gondor, Rohan will ride to their aid, but he doesn't want that. Luckily, Saruman fails. His own Palantir falls into Gandalf's possession, but Pippin, one of the hobbits, looks into it, very briefly interacts with Sauron. Sauron doesn't perceive their plan to destroy the ring, thankfully, but he does realize Pippin is a hobbit, and he thinks that means that Pippin is the nasty little hobbit that has Sauron's favorite piece of jewelry. Gandalf takes Pippin to Minas Tirith, and Sauron begins his siege on Minas Tirith because he thinks they have his ring. And so he attacks sooner than he had planned on it because he's afraid that Gondor is going to use his own ring against him, basically. By now, he's fallen so far into darkness that it doesn't even occur to him that someone could even want to destroy the ring. He can't fathom the idea that anyone would not just be beholden to that amount of power that you could potentially have, that someone would be willing to give all that up for like the greater good. He just cannot even comprehend that, which is really what makes the secrecy of Frodo's mission so essential. So he attacks Minas Tirith. Thankfully, Rohan, the Dunedain, and Aragorn's spooky ghost army come to aid the city, and they all join forces with Gondor, and they're able to win the battle and save Minas Tirith. Yay. Spoopy. By this point, what remains of the Fellowship, they know they're running out of time. Destroying the ring was really a last resort, because even without it, Sauron's forces are powerful enough that if they don't think of a way to pull through all of this, their quest is going to fail. So they do the only thing they can think to do. They get a bunch of dudes together and ride to the Black Gate on a suicide mission just so that they can try to distract Sauron and get all of his multitudes of orcs out of the middle of Mordor so that Sam and Frodo can cross it to actually reach Mount Doom without being detected. Sauron falls for this plan, obviously, because he thinks that Aragorn has the Ring of Power now. And, you know, also he's a little pissed that someone would dare to use his own ring against him. How very dare. So he sends his forces to the front gates of Mordor to engage with the people from Gondor now. This is what allowed Frodo and Sam to reach the volcano when the ring was finally destroyed. Intermission, I guess, for a life hack. If you don't have tooth black, this stuff will work. It's waterproof. I use it on my mouth because it goes on and you gotta work to get it off. So you just, dry your teeth off with like a napkin or a cotton swab, and then you paint how you want to do it. So when the ring was destroyed, it was all over for Sauron. It was unmade, I guess. Mount Doom exploded, fire everywhere, killed the ring wraiths. The explosion caused earthquakes, which destroyed Barad-dûr along with its foundations this time. So it was gone for good. Sauron wasn't actually destroyed with the ring. I think there's some misconception about that. Its destruction ended his ability to influence the world around him. He was never able to gain power again because of its destruction. So when he was defeated, he hovered really briefly over Mordor like a dark shadow, but he was blown away by a nice breeze. So to quote my favorite Tolkien podcast, Keep on Tolkien, he got blown away just kind of like a fart in the wind. So there you go. That's the story of Sauron. So that's the story of Sauron. I hope that you have enjoyed our time together. I really have. This was fun to shoot. I enjoy doing this makeup look. It's not too complicated, but with the whole outfit together, it's effective. I'll say that. If I have made a mistake about anything, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I really thank you for listening this far. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you didn't, thanks for giving me a chance. One last touch. All right, and now that we have reached The end. It's time for a little section I like to call Metal Music Monday. This is where I tell you about a song that I've had on repeat this week. Maybe we like the same music, maybe it's new to you. Either way, I think music is essential and I want to share the things that I like with the people that I like. So this week I'm listening to Morpheus in a Masquerade by Cain's Offering, and you should too. It's a melodic power metal song with some really pretty poetic lyrics, and I think if you like Nightwish or if you like Camelot, then this will really vibe with you. And if you don't know who those other two bands are, then you should check them out also because they are awesome. Fantastic band. And if you've gotten this far, let me know in the comments that you reached the end of the video by typing Morpheus, come take me away. Anyway, bye for now.